Thomas's Friendship Adventures, Episode 2, The Trouble with Fish. The island of Sodor is a busy, bustling place. There's always lots and lots of work for the engines to do. One day, Thomas and James were in the yard when Sir Topham Hatt came to see them. The fishermen are celebrating their biggest catch of fish ever. Thomas and James, you two must help Arthur take the fish to the docks. Thomas and James were fed up. They didn't like the smell of fish. And when they got to the fishing village, there were lots of freight cars, all stacked with fish. Thomas and James had never ever seen so many fish. Phew, what a horrible smell, remarked Thomas. James had to agree. Then Arthur arrived. Arthur warned Thomas and James that the route to Brendam Docks was bumpy. Only take 5 freight cars at a time, said Arthur, and go slow and steady. Arthur carefully collected 5 freight cars. Then he steamed slowly out of the harbor yard. Thomas and James looked at the long line of freight cars. They didn't want to go slow and steady. They wanted to get their smelly job over with. So Thomas and James shunted all of the freight cars into one long line. The freight cars were heavy and smelly, but Thomas and James were pleased that their job would soon be over. But then the troublesome trucks decided to have some fun. They wiggled and they giggled, and they made the journey very difficult. Some of the fish were shaking loose. Some of it landed on the tracks, while others landed on Thomas and James. Yuck, said James. I wish we could have taken fewer freight cars, agreed Thomas. Thomas and James huffed and puffed. They pushed a long line of freight cars up the steep hill. They started to puff down the other side. Thomas and James tried to go slowly, but the troublesome trucks wanted to go faster. On, they cheered. Thomas and James went faster and faster. Cinders and ashes, cried Thomas. Help, wailed James. Salty was at the bottom of the hill. He had stopped at a signal. He didn't know Thomas and James were coming down the hill. Thomas and James were out of control. They both braked as hard as they could, but the freight cars of fish were just too heavy. Oops, said James. Sorry, Salty, said Thomas. Salty was covered in fish. Never mind me, hearties, he said. The smell reminds me of the sea. Thomas's driver telephoned for help, and soon Harvey was clearing away the track. Thomas and James were wondering what Sir Topham Hatt would say. They found out soon enough. You two have caused confusion and delay, Sir Topham Hatt said crossly. You two must learn to be more safe. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir, said Thomas and James sadly. So this time, Thomas and James shunted only 5 freight cars together. Thomas coupled on in front, while James was coupled onto the back. Thomas took a deep breath, and they shoved away. Thomas and James steamed through the countryside. We will get to the docks on time, cried Thomas. But the troublesome trucks were soon up to their old tricks again. Hold back, they giggled. But this time there were only 5 trucks. Thomas and James biffed and bashed and bumped them, and the trucks weren't troublesome anymore. As soon as they delivered the first freight cars, Thomas and James went back to collect the next 5. Their axles smelled of kippers, and their cabins smelled of cod. But they were working so hard, they forgot all about the smell. At last, they had just one more load to take. But it was nearly time for the ship to leave. Thomas and James puffed as fast as they could. Their axles ached and their bumpers were bashed, but they got to the docks just in time. Thomas and James were very happy to say goodbye to the fish. Then Sir Topham Hatt came to see Thomas and James. I know you two don't like the smell of fish, but you've both worked very hard. You are both really useful engines. Thomas and James were proud, but they still had the smell of fish, and they couldn't wait to be cleaned, so they puffed off to the washdown. Arthur and Salty were already there. Getting clean is lovely, said Arthur. Best part of the day, said Salty. Especially when you smell a fish, chuckled Thomas. And they all happily agreed.